Right, okay, hi everyone. This is a video for week 4 in which we talk primarily about induction. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how to write an essay because although some of you wrote some really good essays, it was also evident to me that a lot of you don't have so much experience and you need a little bit of practice, and that's okay. I mean, you're new to university and we're going to get you up to scratch on that. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about induction, seeing as that's what the test is going to be about on Thursday morning, and that's what the lecture will be on too. So first of all, let's just think about some examples of inductive inferences and how they differ to deductive inferences, and how you have inductive arguments and how inductive arguments differ to deductive arguments. The main difference is that with a deductive argument, the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. Okay? So if the premises are definitely true, then a valid deductive argument will provide a conclusion that is also necessarily true. Okay, so for example, you might say, here's some keys. Okay, so we've got some keys here. All keys are metal. Okay, there's premise 1. Premise 2, this is a bunch of keys. Conclusion, this little thing here is metal. Okay, so all keys are metal, this is a bunch of keys, therefore this is metal. Given the two premises, the conclusion had to be true. Now that is a deductive argument. The same thing goes for all bachelors are unmarried men. Jimmy is a bachelor, therefore Jimmy is an unmarried man. Perhaps this is either a pen or it is a sheep. It's not a sheep, therefore it's a pen. Okay, so all of these things, you can see how the conclusion necessarily follows given that the premises are true. Okay, so the conclusion is true so long as the premises are true. That's the case with valid deductive arguments. Inductive arguments, on the other hand, aren't quite like that. It is possible, in the case of an inductive argument, for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So, suppose, all observed ravens are black. Okay, so today I observed a raven. I've observed lots of ravens in the past, and every single raven that I've seen has been black. And I draw the conclusion that the next raven I see will be black. In fact, I might even draw the conclusion that all ravens are black, not just the observed ones, all ravens that ever have been, and all ravens that ever will be, they'll all be black. I could draw that. That would be an inductive argument. But remember, the premises to this argument, that is, all observed ravens have been black, do not guarantee the conclusion. It is possible that all observed ravens have been black and a future one to be not black. I mean, in England, for example, we used to think that all swans were white. And so we naturally drew the conclusion that all swans all around the world were white, and then we went to Australia and found black swans. Okay, so we drew this inductive argument, and it was a good inductive argument, or at least it seemed like a good inductive argument, but the conclusion turned out to be false. Okay, so that seems to be one big difference between a deductive argument and an inductive argument. With a deductive argument, a valid one anyway, it is not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. But an inductive argument, even a good one, the conclusion can turn out to be false, Okay, so that's really the main difference between inductive and deductive arguments. Now there are lots of different kinds of inductive argument. Sometimes we talk about what's happened in the past to what's going to happen in the future. Sometimes we go from just individual observed instances to universal generalizations. So universal generalization is when we say all things are like this, right, where we refer to a particular type of thing. So you might say all ravens are black. That's a universal generalization. Okay? All philosophy professors have beards, right? That's a universal generalization. It's false, obviously, because lots of philosophy professors don't have beards, but it's a universal generalization nonetheless. So we might say, for example, all observed chairs have been blue, therefore all chairs are blue. That's an inductive inference. Or we might say Manchester United have won every game they've ever played, so the next game they play, they will win. That's an inductive inference too, an inductive argument. Okay? They're slightly different. Okay? One's saying the next time this is going to happen. Okay? One's saying all things are like this. Okay? Both different kinds of argument in some ways, but both inductive arguments because they both share the feature, where the premises can be true and the conclusion false. Okay, so there are some different kinds of example. We're going from the observed to the unobserved. Okay, that's what's happening in inductive arguments most of the time. Okay, so what's the problem? Well, the problem with inductive arguments is precisely that the conclusion can be false given the premises. Deductive arguments are great. I mean, you know, if I know that all bachelors are unmarried men and I know that Bob is a bachelor, then I know that Bob's an unmarried man. Great. Awesome. Okay. The problem with inductive arguments is that I can know the premises. I can even know that the argument's a good one. But even if I know that it's a good inductive argument and I know that the premises are true, I can't guarantee that the conclusion is true. So, as I said with the swans example, I know that all swans were white, or at least, you know, that's what we used to think back in England. And we kind of know that structure of argument with things like swans and properties like whiteness and so on, they tend to be good inductive arguments. So it was a good inductive argument that all swans were going to be white, and yet it turned out to be false. So the main problem is justifying our inductive conclusions, you know, justifying what we call our inductions. Now, we might not care so much about swans and whether they're all white, but we make inductions all the time, and we want our inductions to be justified. Okay, I believe that when I wake up tomorrow, I'm going to stick to the floor, right? I believe that gravity is going to hold. I'm not going to just walk out my second floor window thinking, oh, well, you know, beliefs that, you know, gravity is going to hold, they're not really justified because inductive inferences aren't justified. So I might as well just walk out the window today because I think I'm going to fly to work, right? That's not what we do. We want our inductive inferences to be justified. And the problem of induction is finding a way of proving that our inductions, or at least some of our inductions, are in fact justified. Okay. So how can we do this? Well, there have been lots of different attempts. Some have tried to provide probabilistic arguments like Reichenbach, not going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is something that we deal with on a far more regular basis, namely laws of nature and causation, and the kind of thing that lead us to conclude that I'm going to stick to the floor tomorrow and that I should walk down the stairs and not jump out the window tomorrow. And what I'm going to do is go through David Hume's arguments. Okay, so David Hume, 18th century Scottish philosopher, falls into what we call the empiricist categories. That tends to mean that the beliefs that he holds tend to be grounded in experience. Empiricists tend to believe that we shouldn't really believe things that we can't experience. Okay. So what does he think? He holds the following principle. He believes that we have these things called impressions. Okay, so an impression it's like a vivid image, the kind of image you get when you look at something directly or when you hear something directly. Okay, so I look at my little blackboard there, and I've got an impression of the blackboard, an image in my mind of the blackboard. It's very vivid. I look at my computer screen now, and I'm looking at my face in the camera, and I've got a vivid impression, okay, of my face, and the fact that I kind of need to trim my beard a little bit. Okay, so he's got these things called impressions. He's also got these things called ideas. Now, ideas are a bit like impressions, but they're less vivid. Okay? They're the kind of thing you get when you close your eyes and you imagine the blackboard. So I'm closing my eyes, I'm imagining the impression that I had a moment ago. Okay? So it's very much like an impression, but it's far less vivid. Similarly with a sound, you know, I listened to the Beatles this morning because, you know, sadly, you know, the guy we refer to as the fifth Beatle died this morning. It was very sad. But anyway, I listened to Penny Lane, my favourite Beatles song this morning, and now I close my eyes and I remember the song, and I kind of hear the song in my head, but I don't hear it as vividly as I did when I was listening to it on the television this morning. You know? So that's an idea. Hume says that you cannot have an idea of something that you haven't had an impression of. Okay? So I've seen this black colour before, and it's because I've seen black. It's because I've had that vivid impression of blackness that I can close my eyes and imagine what a blackboard looks like. It's because I've heard Penny Lane, right, and the tune, the music, that I can imagine the song Penny Lane. If I hadn't heard those notes, directly perceived those notes very vividly, then I wouldn't be able to imagine the notes in a sort of slightly less vivid way. Okay, so this is what Hume said. He calls this the copy principle. Okay, so every single idea that you have, that is the kind of less vivid thing that you imagine or dream about and so on, right? Every single one of those has been copied from an impression. And sometimes you kind of construct the ideas. So, you know, I can imagine a unicorn, okay? I can imagine a unicorn. I've never seen a unicorn, but I have seen, you know, the colours that my unicorn in my head will be, right? I've seen shapes that my unicorn will be comprised of. You know, I've seen horses, and I've seen triangles, and you know, for the little thing. And I know what a unicorn, and I have an idea of a unicorn because I can put all the ideas, put all the impressions that come together to make this thing, and I can sort of put them all together and make this unicorn up in my head, you know. But I wouldn't be able to imagine a colour that I haven't seen, or imagine a sound that I haven't heard. Okay. So that's the copy principle. How does this fit into our story about induction? Well, one of the ways in which we try to justify our inductions is by saying, okay, well, tomorrow the sun's going to rise because it has to. Right? There's some kind of necessary connection between massive objects and gravity, right? The reason that snooker ball's going to move off when I hit it with this other snooker ball is that there's a necessary connection between these two events. The first snooker ball hitting the second one and the second ball moving off. There's a necessary connection between the two. And we tend to believe that these necessary connections are all around us. There's some kind of necessary connection between massive objects that means that I'm going to have to stick to the floor, right? That's where gravity comes from. There's some kind of necessary connection between the two. And it's because of these necessary connections that I can justifiably infer what's going to happen in the future, right? I can infer that this second billiard ball, snooker ball, whatever, is going to move after this first one hits it, you know, when I throw it in a moment, because there's a necessary connection between the two. And that justifies my inductive inference. my prediction about what's going to happen in the future. Okay. Hume says, okay, well, if you're going to justify your inductions that way, then we need to have some idea of what a necessary connection is. Now remember, Hume thinks that if we're going to have an idea of something, we also have to have an impression of it. Right? That is, we have to have directly perceived it, a vivid kind of image of necessary connection. So Hume asks us to imagine what that impression would look like. You know, look around the world, we see billiard balls hitting one another. Do we see necessary connection? And Hume says, no, we don't. Hume says, all we see is one event followed by another. One billiard ball hits the other moves off. We don't see anything in addition to that. There's no kind of spooky connection that we can actually observe. We just see one event and then another event. So there's nowhere for the idea to come from. But we kind of do have an idea of necessary connection when we talk about it all the time. So what is this idea of necessary connection? Well, Hume says the impression from which we get the idea of necessary connection isn't actually in the objects at all. It's in the mind. It's some sort of habit of the mind to imagine the second event given the first event. We project a kind of sensation of inevitability that the second ball is going to move given the first. But that sensation of inevitability is not in the object, it's in the mind. Okay? So the idea of necessary connection is actually copied from an impression that's just a mental thing. It's not to be found in the objects. And given that it's not to be found in the objects, given that necessary connection isn't to be found in the object, it doesn't justify our inductive inferences about what's going to happen next. Okay, that's his idea, right? So our inductions are not justified because our idea of necessary connection isn't actually an idea of something that's in the objects, it's an idea of something that's in the mind, that's projected onto the objects. And this kind of mental thing, that has got nothing to do with what the balls have to do when they hit one another. It's just one event followed by another. And because we see those events all the time, we form this habit in our mind. We think that that second ball is going to happen because we're so used to the second ball moving and that we project this necessity onto it. But the necessity is not really there. It's just imagined. Okay. So, how can we respond to Hume? Well, one way to respond to Hume is to just deny the copy principle and say, look, if the copy principle were correct, then all right, I'll take your argument on board. But the copy principle doesn't actually work. How do we prove this? Well, we just think of an idea that's not copied from an impression. Now, Hume himself provides such an example. He asks us to imagine a spectrum of different shades of blue, going from really dark to really light. We've all had this, we all know the hue blue, right? And we've all seen different shades of blue, very dark shades, very light shades, and it's quite plausible that there's one or more shades of blue that we've never actually seen. And yet we can sort of imagine what this would be like. You know, I can say, right, suppose there's shades of blue 3 and shade of blue 5, but I've never seen shade of blue 4. Now, shade of blue 4 is slightly lighter than shade of blue 3 and slightly darker than shade of blue 5. I can imagine what shade of blue 4 looks like, even though I've never had that direct, vivid impression of shade of blue 4. So I can have an idea of it, I can close my eyes and imagine what that shade would look like, even though I've never seen that shade directly. And this seems to directly contravene Hume's principle. Right? Hume's copy principle seems to turn out false. Now Hume actually says, look, here's this example, but these examples are few and far between, so never mind, we shouldn't really pay any attention to them. But one might argue that, look, that's not good enough, Hume, your copy principles turned out to be false, and maybe necessary connection is just like the missing shade of blue. Maybe we can have an idea of necessary connection even though we don't actually directly perceive necessary connection in objects. That's one possible response. Okay, so that's a kind of Humean attempt at justifying induction, and Hume's attempt at showing that it doesn't work. But maybe there are others. Maybe there are other ways of justifying inductive inferences. One way of doing it is to say, well, look, it's not that difficult to justify induction. I use inductive inferences all the time, and they work. They work really well. Every single time I get out of bed in the morning, I rely on inductive inferences to say, okay, well, this is how I'm going to behave. I've bet on Manchester United to win for the last 10 weeks. Every time I bet on them to win, they've won. Why have they won? Well, I've been basing those predictions on what they've done in the past, and every time it's worked. Induction works really well, and so I'm justified in believing that induction will continue to work in the future. This seems all well and good, but it's circular. That is to say, it begs the question. We are trying to justify the principle of induction using induction. By saying induction has worked in the past, therefore it will work in the future, that in itself is an inductive inference. So we're using induction to justify induction, and you can't do that. Right? That's begging the question. It's circular reasoning. It's a bad argument. Okay. So that's the old problem of induction, the standard problem of induction. Nelson-Goodman provides us with a new problem of induction, called the new riddle of induction. The new riddle of induction asks us to imagine a new predicate. So we're used to talking about predicates like green and blue all the time. These are sort of properties. They apply to properties. So you'd say the apple is green. The apple is the subject. Green is the predicate. Okay. So we apply predicates all the time. He tries to get us to imagine a new predicate called grew. Now, an object is grew if and only if it is first observed before the year 3000 and green, or first observed after the year 3000 and blue. Okay, that's what a grew object is. So all emeralds, okay, so imagine emeralds. All emeralds observed thus far have been green. We know that. But they've also been grew because, of course, we live in the year, currently, 2016, and that's before the year 3000, and all those emeralds have been green, and an object is grew if it's first observed before the year 3000 and green. So all those emeralds, they're both green and grew. Great. So every single observed emerald has been green. What does that lead us to believe in sort of using inductive logic? Well, all emeralds are green. Right? All observed emeralds have been green, therefore we conclude all emeralds are green. Okay, that seems like a good inductive inference. But of course, all emeralds have also been grew. Right? They've all been observed to be grew. So we can say, okay, well, another inductive inference, another sort of good inductive inference using exactly the same structure is to say all emeralds are grew. So we've got all observed emeralds are grew to all emeralds are grew. But what happens after the year 3000? Well, using our inductive inference, all emeralds are green, we would expect all emeralds to continue to look green. You know, the ones that are found after the year 3000, they will also look green. But if we've concluded that all emeralds are grew after the year 3000, we should expect the ones that we observed the first time after the year 3000 to be blue, because to be grew is to be either first observed before the year 3000 and green, or first observed after the year 3000 and blue. So all emeralds are GRU would lead us to expect all emeralds first observed after the year 3000 to be blue. But then we've got contradictory inferences. Right? Both of them seem to be using exactly the same inductive logic. One of these, the all emeralds are green, leads us to think that all observed emeralds after the year 3000 will be green, and the other, all emeralds are GRU, leads us to think that all emeralds after the year 3000 will be blue. But which one should we use? I mean, we've used exactly the same logic in both cases. This is the new riddle. Now, naturally, right, we're going to think, obviously, you should choose the green ones because, you know, GRU is just this gerrymandered property. You've just made it up. You've said, well, it's green before the year 3000 and blue thereafter. Well, it's possible that we live in a world where people talk about GRU and bleen, right? Where bleen is, say, blue before the year 3000 and green if first observed after the year 3000. You know, if we're imagining possible worlds, we can imagine a world in which people don't generally talk about green and blue. They talk about GRU and bleen. And when you sort of say, no, green is the right property, they'll say, well, no, green is just the property of GRU before the year 3000 and bleen after the year 3000. Okay? That's what green is. So these people are going to think that green and blue are strange properties. So we can't just sort of appeal to our gerrymandered properties. So what can we do? Well, Nelson Goodman says, look, it's okay. There are things called natural properties and unnatural properties. GRU is an unnatural property. It is not a real property like green or charge -1 or mass, right? These are natural properties. GRU is not a natural property. And then I say, okay, well, how can we tell the difference between natural properties and unnatural properties? And Goodman says, well, look, just naturally, if you like, it is the natural properties that we use. We use a finite number of predicates, and we don't talk about GRU, and we don't talk about bleen, but we do talk about green, and we do talk about blue. Green and blue are what you call well-entrenched predicates, okay? And it's the well-entrenched predicates that correspond to natural properties. So when we're making inductive inferences, we should stick to well-entrenched predicates. Only well-entrenched predicates can be used in good inductive inferences. So that's what Goodman says. Okay, so that'll kind of conclude our talk of induction for the time being. I'm going to stop this video now, and then I'm going to do another one for essay writing that you can use before test 2, term test 2, and before your exam at the end of the semester. Okay, see you in the morning.